This question is from World History segment, and the question is the continental system of Napoleon was his great blunder. We have to discuss it. Okay, this question is simply asking to discuss that how continental system ensured the decline of Napoleon. Okay, this we have to discuss. This is a very simple question. Okay, this is a part of world history, and in world history we have to discuss a chapter that is French Revolution and what happened after French Revolution. Okay, Napoleon was a ruler in France. He was a very popular ruler. We will discuss about Napoleon in detail. Okay, so this policy which we are talking about, continental system, this was announced by Napoleon. This was a continental blockade policy, continental system which we are talking here, continental system. Continental system was a continental blockade policy. Continental system was a continental blockade policy, and it was announced by Napoleon, and it was directed against Britain. It was announced by Napoleon and it was directed against Britain. So this we have to discuss. Announced by Napoleon, directed against Britain. You have to understand that this policy will create a great deal of dissatisfaction in all other countries of Europe against France. Okay, even the people of France are dissatisfied by Napoleon, who introduced this continental blockade system. Okay, so let's discuss what this system is. You have to remember this thing that whenever we are talking about Europe, this phase in Europe 1804 to 1814-15 is known as Napoleon's Era. Okay, and under the control of Napoleon became the emperor in France. Okay, France rose to such a status that the only big challenge before France was Britain, and Britain was a very powerful country at that time. Britain has developed hundreds of colonies all around the world. Okay, and Britain has a kind of maritime supremacy. Okay, Britain has naval superiority over other countries of Europe, and France wanted to counter Britain. So what was important for that? To just attack on the economic backbone of Britain. This was the main target of Napoleon era. Okay, so Britain was basically a country that was focusing heavily on trade and commerce, and that is why you will later on study while discussing the world history, I will tell you that Britain was following a policy of a splendid isolation, was keeping itself out from the European affairs. Why? Because Britain was focusing mainly on the trade and commerce. Just you can remember this thing that Britain, East India Company came to India for doing trade in 1600 and 1757. Okay, they were in the role of the traders. So Britain was focusing on trade and commerce, and now Napoleon decided to just attack on the economic backbone of Britain. So what Napoleon did? Napoleon announced some orders that are popularly known as Berlin Decree and Milan Decree in 1806 and 1807. And in this order, what Napoleon did? Napoleon was basically dictating the European affairs at that time. So what Napoleon announced is that the British ships will be banned from entering the European ports. Now you can easily understand the intention behind this. The British ships are banned from entering the European ports. That means you are attacking the economic backbone of Britain. Another decree was announced. Okay, and the next decree was aimed at stopping the smuggling. This was nothing but to give a moral justification for what Napoleon was doing. Okay, that what Napoleon was saying, that I am doing all these things to stop the smuggling activities. Okay, but what was the main intention? I have discussed with you earlier. So in Milan Decree, it was said that those ships, okay, which are neutral ships, and if they will stop land in Britain while following any route or passage, if they will stop or land in Britain, what will happen? These ships will be confiscated. Okay, it means that you are just trying to disconnect Britain from the economic affairs or the engagement with other countries. So this was the main intention of Napoleon. Okay, and why Napoleon was doing this? Because Napoleon alone want to dominate the European affairs. Okay, so that is why it was an attempt to counter Britain. Okay, so France was also trying to develop its naval power, but it was not equal to the strength of Britain at this point of time. So Napoleon was knowing it very well that in sea battles, okay, when we are fighting sea battle with Britain, it was difficult to defeat Britain. So that is why this economic blockade was introduced. The policy of continental blockade, economic blockade, was introduced so that the Britain will start facing economic hardships, and at some point of time Britain will surrender. Okay, so this policy was introduced by Napoleon, and this was one of his greatest mistakes in history. And this question is asking about this, why this was the greatest mistake of Napoleon. First thing is that what Napoleon was doing by introducing this policy. Napoleon was basically targeting an impossible thing to do. Napoleon was targeting Britain. Napoleon was attempting to stop the commercial activities of Britain through sea. That was near to impossible. Why it was near to impossible? Because in England, what we see, the Industrial Revolution started in the year 1760s. And when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, we are talking about a method of production in which goods will be produced in factories on a large scale. Okay, so definitely the goods will be cheaper. So when you will stop economic activities of Britain, the people of Europe will find themselves in a great difficulty to get the cheaper materials from the Britain, because Britain was providing the cheaper materials due to the Industrial Revolution. So Britain, many countries of Europe were dependent on Britain for the supply of their goods at that point of time. Even France, the people of France were dependent on British goods. And what Napoleon was doing? Napoleon was stopping Britain from supplying those goods. So what will happen when the supply of these British goods will stop? The countries which will face difficulties definitely are going to raise their concern. And when the sudden supply of these British goods will stop, what will happen? The lack of supply and increase in demand will create a mismatch, and that will finally raise the cost of the goods. Okay, so this will contribute to the inflation also. So the people are dissatisfied. The people in entire Europe are dissatisfied by this decision of Napoleon. Okay, so this was not a very popular decision. This was an unpopular decision. And what these unpopular decisions are capable to do? Okay, if you are taking unpopular decisions as a statesman, definitely the people will start losing sympathy in you. The people will start raising voices against you. So definitely this will happen. The people started raising their voices against Napoleon. The countries started raising their voices against Napoleon. Okay, so this will create a great deal of dissatisfaction. And another important aspect that we can write in this question is that, okay, what will happen when you will stop suddenly supply of certain goods? This will increase the smuggling activities. So these smuggling activities were also increased. Black marketing was also increased. The prices of goods and commodities will also increase. So these are going to create some sort of problems before the people of Europe. And entire Europe is now disturbed by this continental blockade policy. Okay, and now most of the countries are dissatisfied. So what they will try to do? They will start conspiring against the Napoleon and the France. Okay, they don't want the further implementation of these schemes, but Napoleon is adamant not to step back. What will happen? Okay, what will happen if Napoleon is adamant not to step back? The other countries who are facing difficulties due to the implementation of this scheme will start uniting. Okay, so what we see here that the kind of resistance increased against the Napoleon due to the implementation of such kind of schemes. Okay, and Napoleon was very overconfident about his intelligence and the abilities. Okay, and Napoleon had never any ifs and buts about his decisions, so he was adamant. It was a matter of his pride and ego, so he was adamant to implement this scheme, and this become a fundamental error. And this fundamental error, what do we see? Okay, we see that this create a great deal of dissatisfaction and finally contributed to the decline of Napoleon. Okay, there are some other mistakes also which Napoleon did in his rule. So this question is mainly related to the continental system of Napoleon and why it was a great blunder. Okay, so simply you can write what was the continental system of Napoleon, components of continental system of Napoleon, why it was introduced, okay, the kind of dissatisfaction, okay, it created, which finally contributed to the decline of Napoleon. Okay,